2 days later, Sophie found herself lying on the couch with Ethan sprawled beside her, the soft hum of the air conditioning and the fading buzz of their shared intimacy wrapping around them like a cocoon. But the peaceful moment was cut short when her phone began to vibrate relentlessly on the coffee table. Sophie groaned and stretched to grab it, her breath still uneven. She glanced at the caller ID and sighed. It was Tina, one of her closest friends and a buddy from her college days. "Tina," Sophie answered, trying to steady her voice. "Hey, Sophie. We're having a little reunion with some of our college friends and classmates. It's at that resto bar near your place. Still early, just the afternoon. Thought I'd see if you're free to join us?" Tina's voice was cheerful, but it dipped into curiosity at the faint panting she could hear. "I'm, exercising," Sophie replied, her voice hitching slightly. Ethan's lips quirked into a grin, clearly amused by her attempt to sound nonchalant. Tina, not fooled for a moment, coughed theatrically. "Oh, exercising, are we?" Sophie cleared her throat, willing the flush in her cheeks to subside. "We're just on a break for now." "Uh-huh," Tina teased. "Speaking of which, how's Ethan? Is he, doing okay?" Sophie paused, her tone softening. "His memories aren't the same, but honestly, I think I've fallen for him all over again. And from the way he looks at me, I think he feels the same." "Oh my," Tina replied with a cheeky tone. "You'd better come down here ASAP. We'd love to see the evidence of all this exercise." Before Sophie could protest, Tina hung up, leaving her with no choice but to get ready. At the resto bar, Tina was seated with Mia and her husband, Andrew, a tall, reserved French businessman who still struggled with English and was awkwardly lingering on the side. Unfortunately, Brad had also made an appearance, much to the chagrin of both women. When Sophie and Ethan arrived minutes later, Mia and Tina immediately honed in on Sophie like heat-seeking missiles. Their eyes widened at the faint reddening spots visible on her shoulder and thigh, and they exchanged knowing smirks. "Oh, wow, Sophie," Mia teased, leaning closer. "Those are some intense workout results. Care to share your routine?" "Ladies," Sophie said, exasperated but unable to hide her blush, "we're here to catch up, not to interrogate me." As the women laughed and chatted animatedly, a sudden shift in the atmosphere caught Sophie's attention. Ethan, who had been standing quietly beside her, was now engaged in an effortless conversation with Andrew in flawless French. Both Sophie and Mia froze mid-conversation, their jaws practically hitting the table as they turned toward the two men. Ethan's tone was natural, his pronunciation impeccable, as if he were a native speaker. Sophie blinked. "Ethan, you speak French?" Ethan turned to her with a modest shrug, his expression sheepish. Andrew started speaking, and I guess I just understood. It's like my brain picked it up somewhere. Andrew chuckled, finally easing out of his usual discomfort. "He speaks it better than I do. We were just discussing the party and your relationship." Sophie was stunned. She recalled Ethan mimicking languages he'd heard from her laptop or television, but this level of fluency in such a short time seemed impossible. Mia leaned over, whispering, "Is this some post-memory loss genius thing?" Sophie nodded slowly, still processing. "It might be. The doctors did say he could exhibit unusual cognitive abilities. But to this extent?" Tina grinned, elbowing Sophie playfully. "Well, if this is what memory loss does, I think Ethan's leveled up. Multilingual and devoted, what a package." As the group resumed their lively chatter, Sophie watched Ethan, who was now comfortably navigating through the conversation with Andrew. Her heart swelled with pride and amazement. Even with the gaps in his memory, Ethan was proving to be someone extraordinary, a man who continued to surprise her, challenge her, and most importantly, love her in ways that felt entirely new yet deeply familiar. As the night deepened, the group's laughter filled the resto bar, but the undercurrent of tension caused by Brad's presence didn't escape anyone's notice. His habit of hovering nearby, pretending to be part of the conversation while clearly directing his focus towards Sophie, had begun to wear on the group. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Brad approached, his usual self-assured smirk plastered on his face. He gestured towards Sophie's shoulder, where the faint red marks were still visible. "You're still so clumsy, Sophie," Brad said, his tone laced with familiarity that grated on her nerves. "You should take better care of your skin." He stepped closer, his hand halfway raised as if he intended to inspect the marks. Before he could, Ethan spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Sorry about that." The group turned toward Ethan, who had quietly moved beside Sophie. His hand gently brushed over her reddened shoulder, his touch tender and protective. "You told me to pull harder, so I did," Ethan added, his tone sincere, but his words carried a cheeky undertone that made Sophie's face flush. She flicked his forehead, her cheeks now a shade redder than the marks on her skin. "Ethan, don't say things like that so loudly." Ethan chuckled, his boyish grin making her giggle despite herself. Sophie turned to Brad, her smile sweet but her eyes sharp. "It's fine, Brad. Somebody's already taking care of it." Her tone was polite enough, but the message was clear. "Your concern isn't welcome." Brad's confident smirk faltered for a moment, his gaze shifting between Sophie and Ethan. Whatever lingering familiarity he thought he had with her was now replaced by the undeniable bond she shared with Ethan, a bond that left no room for him to insert himself into her life anymore. Sophie leaned into Ethan slightly, the warmth of his presence grounding her. As Brad retreated awkwardly, Sophie allowed herself a satisfied smile, her heart swelling with gratitude for the man beside her. Ethan might not have all his memories, but the way he stood by her, now steadfast and protective, made her realize she didn't need the old Ethan to return. The one she had now was more than enough. One morning, Brad had arranged to meet with Sophie's grandfather and parents. Brad confidently seated at the grand dining table in Sophie's family estate, chatting animatedly with her parents and grandfather. He regaled them with his supposed successes over the past 2 years, weaving stories of thriving startups and his entrepreneurial genius. "Of course," Brad said, leaning back smugly. "My companies are flourishing now. I've learned a lot since college, and I've grown into a man capable of leading ventures to success." He conveniently omitted the string of failures and issues that plagued his businesses. Eventually, the conversation shifted to Ethan. Brad, feigning concern, sighed dramatically. "I'm worried about Sophie. Since she started associating with that man, she's been different. Walking around with no shame, flaunting. Well, you've seen it yourselves. It's clear he's using her for her money. A man like that, with no real achievements, can't possibly have her best interests at heart." Sophie's parents exchanged uncertain glances, but her grandfather frowned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Brad. Brad continued, undeterred. "I made mistakes in the past, but I've changed. That one indiscretion, that moment of weakness is behind me. I've learned my lesson. I only want to make things right, rekindle the bond between our families, and fulfill the engagement that was meant to be." Just as he finished, the sound of the front door opening drew everyone's attention. Sophie and Ethan walked in, arm in arm, their confident strides making Brad shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Good morning," Sophie greeted with a polite smile, but her tone carried an edge. "I hope we're not interrupting." Ethan placed a folder on the table, opening it to reveal a meticulously organized set of documents. "Actually, we came prepared to clarify a few things." Sophie stepped forward, addressing her family. Brad has been claiming a lot of success today, but these documents paint a different picture. Most of the companies he mentioned, taken over by a rival due to poor management. 2 of them, acquired by me just last month. She smiled wryly. And as for the talents he claims to have recruited, Ethan personally contacted them after they left, due to the, let's say, toxic work environment. They're now working for us. Brad's confident grin began to falter, but before he could respond, Ethan turned to Sophie's grandfather. Sir, with all due respect, I don't appreciate the slander Brad's been spreading about me. So, I took the liberty of doing a little research. He handed over another folder, this one filled with incriminating evidence. This includes records of his recent divorce due to physical abuse, his extensive debts from various casinos, and most importantly, proof that the only reason he's pushing for this marriage is to escape those debts. The room fell into stunned silence as Sophie's parents and grandfather absorbed the information. Disappointment etched itself onto their faces, their previous doubts about Ethan dissolving as the truth about Brad's character was laid bare. Brad, now visibly sweating, stammered, This is a misunderstanding. Those aren't. Sophie cut him off, her voice cold. We're done here, Brad. I won't let you manipulate my family or insult Ethan. You've had your chances, and you've wasted them all. Her grandfather, always a man of few words, finally spoke. Leave, Brad, and don't come back. With no other options, Brad stood and walked out, his once confident demeanor reduced to nothing more than a defeated slump. As the door closed behind him, Sophie turned to Ethan, her smile softening. Thank you, she said quietly. Ethan simply took her hand in his steady presence more than enough to remind her she'd chosen the right person. As the door clicked shut behind Brad, the tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud began to dissipate. Sophie turned to face her parents and grandfather, her expression resolute. You've been wondering who's been guiding my decisions lately, she began, her voice steady but firm. Some of you even whispered about a so-called genius analyst working behind the scenes. She took a step closer to Ethan, pulling him beside her with a warm, confident smile. Well, here he is. Ethan isn't just the man I love, he's the one who called out those shady businesses that were funneling money into offshore accounts. You remember those? The ones that turned out to be Uncle's doing? Her sharp tone left no room for denial. He dug them up. He's the one who helped me protect this family's assets and grow them. If he's after my money, at least he's not stealing it, he's safeguarding it. Sophie's words left no room for interruption as she continued, her gaze unwavering. He's not a wealthy businessman. He was just an architect, one I thought I'd lost forever. I was afraid of how you'd react, and for a while, I let that fear hold me back. But not anymore. After losing him once, I realized I don't care what anyone says now. He's the only one I need, and quite frankly, your competitors fear me more than they fear any of you now, she added, turning to her grandfather with a knowing look. And if that's not an achievement on his part, I don't know what is. Her words hung in the air, the weight of her conviction leaving her parents and grandfather visibly stunned. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, each second feeling like an eternity, as the elders seemed to deliberate. Finally, after what felt like an agonizing eternity, her grandfather cleared his throat. You've made your case well, Sophie. If this is the man you've chosen, then so be it. His tone was gruff, but carried an undertone of reluctant approval. Sophie's mother smiled softly, stepping forward. We only want you to be happy, dear. If Ethan is the one for you, then he's welcome in this family. Her father nodded in agreement, though his expression was still thoughtful. You've grown into an exceptional woman, Sophie. It seems you found someone who matches that. Relief washed over Sophie as the tension finally broke, and she squeezed Ethan's hand, her smile brighter than ever. "Well," her mother said, clapping her hands together, "if we're welcoming him into the family, I suppose it's only right we celebrate. How about the two of you join us for dinner tonight?" Ethan glanced at Sophie, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'd love to," he said, his voice warm and steady. Sophie nodded, her eyes sparkling with gratitude and joy. "We'd be happy to." As they prepared for dinner, the weight of the day lifted, replaced by the comfort of knowing they had finally secured not just approval but also a newfound unity as a family.
Unstoppable. Killing spree. Double kill. Rampage. You have slain an enemy. Ace. Victory!